Good morning, Year 4, and welcome to another week of home learning. And welcome to a new story. So I've counted the votes, I've counted what titles people wanted, and the winner is Running Wild. Let me remind you of the blurb again. For Will and his mother, going to Indonesia on holiday is a chance to put things behind them and have some fun. But then the elephant Will is riding on the beach begins acting strangely. That's when the tsunami comes crashing in and the elephant begins to run. Except that when the tsunami is gone, Will's elephant just keeps on running. Okay, I wonder who Will and his mum is. We know, don't we, that usually, it might not happen in this book, but usually, early on in the book, we get a description of the characters involved, so we'll see. Lovely day out there, by the way. I've just had a little walk out. It's lovely and fresh and bright, so I feel bright this morning too. Chapter 1. A sudden change of heart. The sea murmured onto the beach. Beneath me, the elephants walked on over silent and soft sand. The further we went along the beach, away from the hotel, away from the distant cries of the swimmers in the sea, the quieter everything became. I was loving the gentle rock and roll of the ride. I closed my eyes and breathed in the peace around me. This was a million miles away from everything that had happened, from everything that had brought me here. It was as I was riding up there on that elephant, swaying in the sun, that Dad's elephant joke came into my mind. Usually I can't remember jokes, but I always remembered this one. Maybe because Dad told it so often. I knew it word for word, just as he would tell it. You know the one about the elephant and the bananas, Will? He'd begin, and without waiting for an answer, off he'd go. A man and a boy were sitting opposite one another in a railway carriage. They were travelling between Salisbury and London. On his lap, the man had a huge paper bag full of bananas, but soon enough the boy noticed that something was very strange going on. The man wasn't eating the bananas. Instead, every few minutes he'd just stand up, open the window, and throw one out. Of course, the boy couldn't understand what he was doing this for. He kept trying to puzzle it out, so in the end he just had to ask. "Excuse me," he says, "but can you tell me why you're throwing all those bananas out of the window?" "To keep the elephants away," replies the man. "'Cause elephants is very dangerous, you know." "But there aren't any elephants around here anyway." "Of course there aren't," the man tells him, throwing yet another banana out of the window. "But that's only because of my bananas. If I didn't keep doing this, there'd be millions of them out here, squillions. And elephants is very dangerous, you know." I loved that joke, mostly because when Dad was telling it, he'd always be heaving with laughter before he could ever finish it, and I loved to hear Dad's laugh. Whenever he was home, it was his laugh that filled the house, brought it alive again. I didn't want to think about that, because I knew where it would lead, and I didn't want to go there. So I tried to make myself think of the train journey instead, a train journey when Dad had been there. I wanted to keep Dad out of the picture. I didn't want to have to remember, not now, not again, but memories of the train journey with Mum came tumbling out of my control and out of sequence, as often memories are. Because memories will always become other memories, I suppose. They can't help themselves. I always wanted train journeys to go on forever, and especially this one. I liked trains, the rattle and the rhythm of them. I loved to press my forehead against the cold glass of the window and trace a single raindrop with my finger as it found its way down across the window. I'd be gazing out at the countryside rushing by, at cows and horses scattering away over the fields, at clouds of starlings whirling in the wind, a formation of geese flying high into the evening sun. And I'd be on the lookout for wild animals, for foxes or rabbits or even deer. A glimpse of just one of these was a marvel to me, the highlight of any train journey, because they hardly ever ran away. They just gazed back at me from their world, interested perhaps, but not concerned. It was as if they were trying to tell me, "We don't mind you being here, just as long as you're passing through, just as long as you leave us alone." I had always longed to be part of their world. For me, that momentary glimpse was never enough. It was always over too quickly. On this train journey, though, I'd seen no foxes, no deer, not even a rabbit, and that was because I hadn't been looking for them. My mind was elsewhere. I didn't want it to be, but it was. Everything out there was nothing but a blur of grey skies and green fields, interrupted with monstrous regularity by the endless passing of telegraph poles. None of it was any interest to me. I wanted this train journey to go on forever, not because I was enjoying it one bit, but simply because I did not want to go where I was going. I did not want to arrive. I glanced up at Mum sitting beside me, but she did not look back at me. I could see she was lost deep in her thoughts, and I knew well enough that that's how it had to be, that her thoughts were much the same as mine, and it was better not to interrupt. I regretted again that I'd yelled at her at breakfast that morning. I shouldn't have done it, but it had been a shock of it, the suddenness. She just said it, right out of the blue, without any warning at all. We're going back home, Will. As soon as I've packed these cases, Grandma says she'll drive us to the station. I tried arguing, but she wouldn't listen. So that was when I yelled at her and did a runner to the hay barn, climbing up into the stack to the very top. I sat sulking there till Grandpa came and found me and fetched me down. Excuse me. Mum was very upset, he told me, and we shouldn't be upsetting her, not after everything that had happened. He was right, of course. I hadn't meant to do it, but I'd been so looking forward to staying for Christmas down on the farm with Grandpa and Grandma. It was the house where Dad had grown up, the place that we'd always been for every single Christmas of my life, whether Dad was at home or on leave or not. But if I'm honest, that wasn't the only reason I'd shouted at her. The truth was I was dreading everything about going home, and what's more, I knew Mum felt the same, which was why it was a complete mystery to me that she was suddenly so anxious to leave. And there was something else I couldn't understand. Before she'd come out with it at breakfast that morning, she'd never even discussed it. She just told me. It wasn't like her. Mum always talked things over with me, always. After all, hadn't she been the one who only a few weeks before had insisted that it was a good idea to go and stay with Grandpa and Grandma, to get away from home and the memories and the ghosts? Hadn't Mum explained to me that she thought we should be with Grandpa and Grandma at this time anyway, because after all, weren't we all going through the same thing, and wouldn't it be good for us to do it together? So why this sudden change of heart? I gazed blankly out of the train window, trying to work it all out. I thought that it might have been because she had just had enough of Grandma, and it was true that Grandma was never the easiest person in the world to get on with. She did like to organise, try and tell everyone what to do, what not to do, and what to think even. With Grandma, everything had to just be so, and that could be a bit irksome at times and annoying. But as Mum was forever telling me, this was just how Grandma was, and we had to put up with it, like Grandpa did. No, we couldn't be leaving because of Grandma. It didn't make any sense. But if it wasn't Grandma, what was it then? It certainly wasn't Grandpa, and it certainly wasn't the farm. For Mum and for me, for all of us, it had always been just about the best place in the whole world. My idea of heaven. I loved being there, whatever the weather. I was up before breakfast with Grandpa, milking the cows, feeding the calves, and then opening up the hens and geese on the way back to the house for breakfast. Afterwards it was out on the tractor with Grandpa again, and driving it sometimes too, when we were far enough away from the farmhouse for Grandma not to spot us. We'd be checking the sheep together, counting the lambs, mending fences where we had to. We'd be doing whatever it was that needed doing, and doing it together. And Grandpa was like a walking encyclopedia of nature. He knew all the bird songs, all the plants. He even had a weekly nature column in the local newspaper, so he knew what he was talking about, and I loved to hear him talking about it too. Grandma said one afternoon when Grandpa and I had come in for tea, "Happy as Larry, you two out on the farm, aren't you? Give you half a chance, I reckon you'd be sleeping in your wellies. You're just like your Grandpa." She was right about that. For a start, Grandpa never said a lot, and nor did I. We knew each other so well that maybe we just didn't need to. Grandpa never mentioned anything about what had happened, except once, when we were down in the milking parlour together, washing down after milking. "Got something to say to you, Will," he began. "What I think is this, and I've thought a lot about it. In fact, these last weeks, I've thought about precious little else. When you've cut yourself, what you do is you make sure the wound is clean and you put a plaster on it, don't you? Then you give it time to heal, if you understand what I'm saying. You don't keep taking the plaster off and looking at it, because if you do, you'll just be reminded of how much it hurts. And if you don't keep asking yourself why it had to happen in the first place either, because that won't make it better either. Sometimes, and I know it's not what some people think these days, but sometimes, when you're hurting, I think the less said, the better. So you and me, we'll say no more about it, unless you want to, that is." But I didn't want to, and so between us nothing was ever said about it again. and in fact Grandma hardly spoke of it either, not in front of me anyway. It became like an unspoken pact between all of us to say nothing, and I was glad of it. I knew well enough that they were doing it for me, to spare me the pain. They were trying their very best to take my mind off it. But the trouble was, it was always there, in the back of our minds, despite all that Grandma and Grandpa were doing to keep everyone busy and happy. And we were happy as it was possible to be under the circumstances anyway. But as each evening came to an end, and the time came for me to go upstairs to bed, I always began to dread the night ahead of me. One look at Mum's face told me we were sharing the same dread. Whether I kept myself with the bedside light on or off made no difference. Lying there in my bed, everything would come flooding back. The ache inside me, the pity of it, and worst of all, the awful finality of it. I longed every night for sleep to come, so that I wouldn't have to remember it all again, so that my mind wouldn't go over it and churn it all up. But the more I longed for sleep, it seemed, the more it was denied me. I'd lie there listening to the murmur of the talk downstairs in the kitchen. If I tried, I could hear most of what they were saying. I didn't want to eavesdrop, but sometimes I couldn't stop myself. I'd hear Mum sobbing again, and Grandma sometimes as well, and soon enough I would find myself crying too. And once I'd started, I knew I wouldn't be able to stop. Not until I fell asleep, because everything Mum was saying down there in the kitchen seemed to echo so closely everything I was feeling. It was her words I was hearing again in my head now as I rode along that beach on the Elephant. Ahead of us a large lizard or iguana skittered away over the sand and disappeared into the shadows of the palm tree. A sea eagle soared out over the sea. There was so much to see, but my memory just wouldn't leave me in peace. I was doing all I could to force myself to live for now, to bask in the joy of the moment, in the beauty of this strange paradise. And for a while I could, and I did, but not for long. So I determined that if I was going to have to relive anything in my mind, it would only be the good times. Driving the tractor with Grandpa, pulling off a newborn lamb, and rubbing the warmth of life into her, seeing the fox padding across the high meadow early one morning. But instead, all that came to mind was everything I'd overheard Mum saying down in the kitchen only a few nights before. Her words still fell just as heavily on my heart when I'd first heard them. Why did he have to go and leave us? What am I supposed to tell Will, Grandma? I mean, how can you tell a 9-year-old? How can you explain the stupidity of it? And all the while I have to put a brave face on it, when what I really want to do is scream. I know he was your son, Grandma. I know I shouldn't say it, and I know I shouldn't feel it, but I do feel it. I love your son. Since the first day I set eyes on him, I've loved him, but I'm so angry with him that sometimes I find myself almost hating him. Isn't it terrible, isn't it? Back home I have to pretend to everyone all of the time that it was all in a good cause, that I'm proud of him, I'm brave, I'm coping. Well, I am proud of him, but I'm not coping, I'm not brave, and it wasn't a good cause. Tell me why. Will someone tell me why? Why did he have to go? Why did it have to be him? When they came up to bed later, and Mum came in to kiss me good night as usual, I pretended to be asleep. I was crying silent tears, and when she'd gone out again they kept coming. All night long they kept on coming. That night I thought I would drown in sadness. I knew that if I went on remembering like this, I would only be making myself live through the same pain over and over again. I wrenched my mind away from where it was taking me. From now on I would only recall the marvellous times, the magical moments that I knew would lift my spirits, that would banish all the grieving that would make me smile. I thought it was working too. I could almost feel Mum's arm round me and hold me, and the coolness of her hand as she smoothed my hair above my ear. But I remembered doing it just like that back at home, on the last day the three of us had had together. I could see it all in my head now, just as it had happened. Dad going off down the path in his uniform, Mum there beside me, watching him go, her arm round my shoulder, her hand smoothing my hair. After we'd waved him off, we stood there on the doorstep in our dressing gowns, watching the milk float come humming down the road. Don't worry, Will, she told me. Dad's been out there twice before. He'll be fine. He'll be back home before you can say Jack Robinson, you'll see. Jack Robinson, I'd say. When I looked up at her moments later, I saw that I'd made her smile through her tears, and I knew that everything would be just right. Every moment of the afternoon, a month or so later, was so deeply etched into my memory. Despite all my best efforts not to, I lived it again now, riding up on the Elephant thousands of miles away from home, from where it had all happened. A rainy Sunday it had been. We were flopped on the sofa in front of the television watching Shrek 2 for about the 10th time. It was my favourite film. Dad had given me the DVD for my birthday a couple of months before. We were enjoying it just as much as ever, anticipating every wacky moment, every hilarious gag. The doorbell rang. "Oh, goodness me, who's that?" Mum said. She pressed the pause button, got up wearily from the sofa, and went to see who it was. I wasn't a bit interested in who it was. I just wanted to go and watch Shrek. There were hushed voices in the hallway. I heard footsteps going along the passage into the kitchen. The door closed. Whoever the visitors were, Mum obviously wasn't coming back into the sitting room for a while. So I pressed the play button and settled down again to watch. Only when the film finished an hour or so later, it did occur to me that it was a little strange that Mum still hadn't come back. I knew she loved Shrek almost as much as I did. That's when I went to find her. She was sitting alone at the kitchen table, her head lowered, her hands cupped round a mug of tea. She didn't look up when I came in. She didn't speak for a while either. I could see that there was something must be wrong. "Who was it?" I asked her. "At the door earlier. Who was it?" "Come and sit down, Will," she said, her voice soft and far away that I could barely hear her. When she looked up, I could see that her eyes were red with crying. "It's your daddy, Will. I told you where he went, didn't I? We found Iraq on the map, didn't we? We found where he was. Well, there was a bomb by the side of the road, and he was in the Land Rover." She reached out across the table and took my hand in hers. "He's died, Will." We sat there in silence for a few moments. I went to sit on her lap, because I knew that was what she needed, what I needed too. We didn't cry, we just held on to each other tight as we could. It felt to me as if we were both trying to somehow squeeze the pain out of one another. Later that night, we lay side by side on my bed holding hands. Neither of us had spoken, not a word, for a long time. Then I asked her one question that had kept coming into my mind again and again all night. "Why, Mum? Why did he have to go to that war?" It was a while before she replied. "Because he's a soldier, Will," she told me. "When countries fight wars, it's the soldiers that do the fighting. It's always been like that. It's what soldiers have to do." "I know that, Mum. Dad told me," I said. "But what was the war for?" She didn't answer me. Okay, we'll leave that one there. So, an interesting start, straight into it. We know that Michael Morpurgo books can start off a little sad, but we know that his story gets better and there's usually a happy ending. So hopefully, fingers crossed, we can have that too. Have a great day. I know you've got lots of good learning to be getting on with, and I will speak to you later on. Take care. Bye-bye.